Danny Hale had never been the kind of man who liked attention. He grew up in a small town in Colorado, the son of a mechanic and a schoolteacher, and he spent most of his childhood fixing engines and reading old books about history. He joined the Colonial Defense Corps when he was 19 because it felt like the right thing to do, and he served for 12 years without ever once telling anyone about the things he saw during the border wars. He carried those memories quietly, the way a man carries a stone in his pocket. It was always there, but he never showed it to anyone. By the time he was 34, he had left the military and taken a job as a diplomatic attaché on the alien world of Vailthrin. It was not a glamorous position. He was one of a handful of humans living on a planet that belonged to the Vailani Dominion, one of the oldest and most powerful civilizations in the Galactic Concord. The Vailani were tall, silver-skinned beings with 4 eyes and long, elegant limbs. They moved like dancers and spoke like poets, and they had been building empires when humans were still figuring out how to make fire. They did not hate humans. That would have required them to take humans seriously. They simply looked at humanity the way a person might look at a small dog that had wandered into a formal dinner party. It was amusing, perhaps even a little endearing, but it certainly did not belong there. Danny did not mind. He had spent his whole life being underestimated, and he had learned a long time ago that the people who underestimated you were the ones who never saw you coming. It was during a border dispute negotiation that he met Sarath Vailani. She was the youngest daughter of High Lord Ketheron Vailani, the head of one of the most powerful noble houses in the Dominion. The negotiation was tense. 2 patrol fleets had nearly opened fire on each other over a misunderstanding about territorial boundaries, and the Vailani commanders were ready to escalate. Danny was supposed to be there as a minor observer, nothing more, but when the shouting started and the alien officers began reaching for their weapons, Danny stood up and spoke. He did not make threats. He simply laid out the facts in plain language, and pointed out that the misunderstanding came from a difference in how the 2 sides measured spatial coordinates. It was a math problem, not a political one. He suggested a simple recalibration of the boundary markers, and offered to oversee the process himself. The room went quiet. The Vailani officers looked at each other, unsure of how to respond to a human who had just solved in 5 minutes what they had been arguing about for 3 days. The matter was settled within the hour. Sarath had been watching from the observation gallery above. She came to find him afterward, moving through the corridor with the effortless grace that all Vailani seemed to possess. She was striking, even by the standards of her own people. Her silver skin had a faint blue undertone, and her 4 eyes were the color of deep water. She looked at Danny with an expression he could not read, and told him that she had never seen anyone stop a war with arithmetic before. Danny told her it was not arithmetic, it was just common sense. She laughed. It was the first time Danny had ever heard a Vailani laugh, and the sound of it changed something inside him that he could not explain. They began meeting in secret. It was not forbidden exactly, but it was understood that a Vailani noblewoman did not spend her time with a human. Sarath did not care. She was different from the rest of her family. She asked Danny questions about Earth, about human history, about the wars and the art and the music, and the way humans somehow kept going, even when everything fell apart around them. Danny told her about the world he came from, about the mountains and the rivers and the way the sky turned orange at sunset. He told her about his parents, about the old cavalry saber that had been in his family for generations, about the tradition of passing it down from father to son, along with the skills to use it. Sarath told him about her world in return. She told him about the weight of being born into a house that measured your worth by the purity of your blood and the sharpness of your blade. She told him about Draven Soreth, the lord she had been promised to since childhood, a match arranged by her father to strengthen political alliances. She told Danny that she had never once been asked what she wanted. 6 months later, Danny asked her to marry him. He did it on the balcony of the diplomatic station, under a sky full of unfamiliar stars, with no ring because he could not afford one. He simply told her that he loved her, and that he would spend the rest of his life proving that he was worthy of her, if she would let him. Seraph said yes before he finished the sentence. When the engagement was announced, the reaction was immediate and brutal. The noble houses of the Dominion were outraged. A human marrying into House Vailani was not just unusual, it was an insult. High Lord Ketharin summoned Seraph to his private chambers, and told her that she was throwing away 10,000 years of heritage for a creature that would be dead of old age before her next century began. Seraph told her father that if he refused the marriage, she would renounce her title and her name and leave the Dominion forever. Ketharin was a proud man, but he was not a fool. He knew that losing his daughter entirely would be a greater scandal than the marriage itself. He agreed, but on one condition. The wedding would be held at the Spire of Falling Stars, the ancient fortress where every Vailani noble union had been consecrated for 6,000 years. Every tradition would be observed, every ritual would be followed. If the human wanted to marry into the bloodline, he would do it the Vailani way, in front of the entire Dominion. It was not a kindness, it was a stage, and Ketharin was betting that Danny would crumble under the spotlight. Danny's best friend, Chris Moran, told him as much the night the arrangements were finalized. Chris was an engineer, a practical man who fixed broken machines for a living and did not believe in fairy tales. He sat across from Danny in the small quarters they shared on the diplomatic station and told him plainly that this wedding was designed to humiliate him. Every noble house in the Dominion would be watching. Every alien who had ever looked down on humanity would be in that hall, waiting for Danny to fail. Danny listened to all of it. He nodded, and then he reached under his bunk and pulled out a long, weathered case made of old earth oak. He opened it and looked at the cavalry saber inside, the one his family had carried for generations. The blade was old and scarred, but it was clean and sharp. Chris looked at the sword, and then looked at Danny and asked him what he was planning. Danny closed the case and told Chris to pack his bags. They had a wedding to attend. The spire of falling stars rose from the peak of a black mountain like a needle aimed at the heavens. It was carved from a single piece of volcanic stone thousands of years ago, and its walls were etched with the names of every noble union ever performed within its halls. At night, the aurora of Vaelthrin's 3 moons painted the spire in shifting bands of silver and violet, and from a distance it looked like something out of a dream. Up close, it looked like what it truly was, a fortress, a monument to power. Danny stood at the base of it and looked up and said nothing. They had arrived by shuttle that morning, a small human party in a sea of alien grandeur. The landing platforms around the spire were crowded with ships from across the Dominion. Sleek Vailani cruisers sat beside ornate diplomatic barges from 6 other species. Banners of noble houses hung from every surface, each one marking a bloodline that stretched back further than human civilization itself. Danny's party consisted of 4 people. Chris Moran carried the equipment and supplies and complained about the gravity, which was slightly heavier than Earth standard. Katie Byrne walked beside Danny with a datapad in her hand, quietly reviewing every Vailani custom and protocol she had spent years studying. She was a cultural liaison officer, sharp and careful, and she had warned Danny 12 times that the next few days would be the most politically dangerous of his life. Sam Greer brought up the rear, a retired Marine with gray hair and steady hands and eyes that never stopped scanning the crowd. He was not officially security. Officially, he was a friend of the Groom. Unofficially, he had a sidearm under his jacket, and he knew how to use it. They were given quarters in the lower levels of the spire, far from the grand suites reserved for the noble houses. The rooms were clean but plain, a subtle message that Danny's place in this event was somewhere near the bottom. The pre-wedding ceremonies began that evening. In Vailani tradition, the days before a noble wedding were filled with rituals meant to honor the joining of 2 bloodlines. There were feasts and recitations, displays of ancestral history, and formal presentations where each house showed its lineage and accomplishments to the assembled guests. The great hall of the spire was enormous. Its ceiling was so high that clouds sometimes formed beneath it, and its walls were lined with holographic projectors that could display images the size of buildings. When the noble houses presented their histories, the holograms filled the hall with scenes of ancient battles, the founding of colonies, the taming of worlds. Bloodlines stretching back 10, 15, 20,000 years unfolded in light and sound, and the Vellani watched with the quiet pride of people who believed that history was the only thing that truly mattered. When it was Danny's turn, the hall went very quiet. He stood alone in the center of the presentation floor. He had no holographic display, no grand visual spectacle. He spoke simply and told them that his family came from a place called Colorado on a planet called Earth. His father fixed cars. His mother taught children. His grandfather served in a war. His great-grandfather served in a different war. He could trace his family back a few hundred years, no further. He told them that his people were young, and that they did not have 10,000 years of history to show. But they had something. They had the stubbornness to keep going. He stopped talking and walked back to his seat. The silence lasted a moment too long, and then the laughter began. It was not loud or cruel in the way a human crowd might laugh. The Vellani were too refined for that. It was a soft, rippling sound, accompanied by the slight tilting of heads and the narrowing of their four eyes, which was the Vellani expression of amusement at something beneath them. It was the laughter of people who had just watched something pathetic and found it mildly entertaining. Katie's jaw tightened beside him. Chris stared at the table. Sam's hand moved an inch closer to his jacket. Danny picked up his drink and took a sip, and did not react at all. The formal banquet came next, and this was where the real damage was done. The Vellani were masters of the elegant insult. Their language had entire grammatical structures dedicated to expressing contempt without ever saying anything directly offensive. A lord from House Terraneth told Danny that humans had a certain charm, the way one might admire the persistence of an insect. A lady from House Moravel asked Sereth, loudly enough for the table to hear, whether she planned to keep her human on a leash or let him roam freely. Another noble remarked that it was a pity human lifespans were so short, because it meant Sereth would barely have to tolerate the arrangement before nature corrected her mistake. Katie translated the worst of it under her breath, the phrases spoken in high dialect that Danny was not supposed to understand. Her voice was flat and controlled, but her hands were shaking. Danny listened to all of it. He ate his food. He nodded politely when spoken to. He did not flinch, and he did not respond. The most dangerous figure at the banquet was Lord Draven Sorath, and Danny had been aware of him from the moment he entered the hall. Draven sat at the high table near Ketharin himself, a place of honor that made his status clear. He was tall, even by Vellani standards, broad-shouldered and lean, with a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. His four eyes were the color of pale fire, and they had not left Danny all evening. Draven did not join in the mockery. He did not need to. His presence alone was the message. He was everything Danny was not. He was Vellani. He was noble. He was a warrior of legendary skill who had fought in campaigns across 3 star systems and had never been defeated in single combat. He had been promised to Sereth since they were children, and that promise had been broken by a human who could not even project a hologram of his own ancestors. Draven simply watched and waited. Late that night, after the banquet had ended and the halls had grown quiet, Sereth found Danny on the eastern balcony of the spire. He was leaning against the railing, looking out at the mountains below, where rivers of bioluminescent algae glowed blue and green in the darkness. She stood beside him and told him she was sorry. She told him that her people did not understand, and that she wished things were different. Danny turned to her and took her hands, and the roughness of his fingers against the smoothness of her silver skin was a contrast that somehow felt right. He told her that she never had to apologize for the people she came from. He told her that he had faced worse than words. He told her that the only thing in this galaxy that mattered to him was standing right in front of him, and nothing anyone said or did was going to change that. Sereth looked at him with all four of her eyes, and in that moment she understood something about humans that her people had never grasped. It was not that they were brave. Bravery was common enough in the galaxy. It was that they were stubborn in a way that went all the way down to the bone. They held on to things, to people, to promises, with a grip that did not let go. She kissed him under the light of 3 moons, and neither of them said anything else for a long time. What Sereth did not know was that Danny had spent the last 6 months doing more than just preparing for a wedding. In the quiet hours after his shifts at the diplomatic station, he had studied. He had read every text he could find on ancient Velani martial traditions, on the old laws that governed noble unions, on the rituals that had fallen out of practice centuries ago. He had found something buried deep in the old codes, a tradition that no living Velani had seen performed. And he had prepared for it. Back in their quarters, Chris looked at Danny when he returned and asked him if he was all right. Danny told him he was fine. Then he asked Chris to make sure the oak case was ready for tomorrow. Chris nodded slowly and did not ask any more questions. He had known Danny long enough to recognize that look. It was the same look Danny had worn the night before every mission during the border wars. It was the look of a man who had already made his decision and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. The morning of the wedding, the sky above the spire of falling stars was the color of burnished copper. The 3 moons of Vaelthrin still hung low on the horizon, fading slowly as the sun rose behind the mountains. It was considered a good omen by the Velani. Danny did not know that. He was standing in his quarters, looking at himself in a mirror that was designed for someone 2 feet taller than him. And he was buttoning the collar of the formal coat Katie had helped him choose. It was human-made, dark navy blue, simple and clean. He looked like exactly what he was. A man from a small town on a small planet, standing in a place where he was not supposed to be. Chris came in and told him the hall was filling up. He said there were thousands of them out there. Nobles, dignitaries, warriors, politicians, and enough broadcast drones to transmit the ceremony to every corner of the Dominion. Half the galaxy was going to watch this. Danny nodded and told Chris to bring the case. Chris hesitated for just a moment, then picked up the long oak case and held it carefully, the way you hold something that matters. Katie met them in the corridor outside the Great Hall. She was dressed in her formal liaison uniform, her datapad clutched against her chest, and her face was tight with worry. She told Danny that she had picked up chatter among the noble houses that morning. Something was happening. The energy in the hall was different from the previous days. There was an excitement in the air that felt wrong, like the crowd was expecting something beyond a wedding. Danny told her he knew. Sam Greer was already inside, standing near the back wall with his arms crossed, and his eyes moving across the crowd in slow, methodical sweeps. He gave Danny a single nod as he entered. The great hall of the Spire of Falling Stars was built like an amphitheater, with rising tiers of seats surrounding a central floor of polished black stone. At the far end, a raised platform held the ceremonial altar where the bonding rites would take place. High Lord Ketharin sat on his throne above the altar, draped in the silver and black of House Velani, his 4 pale eyes watching everything and revealing nothing. Around him sat the elders of the house and the senior lords and ladies of the Dominion's most powerful families. Serath stood on the ceremonial platform in a gown of woven light. It was a traditional Velani wedding garment, and it moved like water around her, shifting between silver and deep blue with every breath. She was beautiful in a way that made the air feel thin, and when her eyes found Danny crossing the hall floor, something in her expression softened. The ceremony began with the rite of bonding. In modern times, this was largely a formality. The groom would stand before the assembled houses, the officiant would recite the ancient words, and the union would be blessed. It was elegant, brief, and predictable. But it contained an old provision that most Vailani had forgotten about. It was written into the earliest versions of the rite, from an era when noble marriages were not just political arrangements, but tests of worthiness. The provision stated that any noble of sufficient rank could challenge the groom's right to join the bloodline by invoking the trial of steel, a ritual duel fought with bladed weapons. If the groom refused, the marriage was void. If he accepted and lost, the marriage was void. If he accepted and won, his place in the bloodline was beyond question forever. It had not been invoked in over 1,000 years. The officiant, an ancient Vailani priestess with silver robes and clouded eyes, began the recitation. Her voice filled the hall like the sound of wind through stone, and the words she spoke were older than most of the civilizations represented in the audience. She called upon the spirits of the bloodline to witness the union. She called upon the groom to present himself. Danny stepped forward into the center of the hall. He stood alone on the black stone floor, surrounded by thousands of alien eyes, and he waited. The priestess asked the traditional question. She asked if any among the assembled houses wished to speak against the union or test the worthiness of the one who sought to join the blood. For a moment there was silence. High Lord Catharin sat still on his throne. He had given orders that the ceremony was to proceed without incident. Whatever his private feelings were, he had made his decision. But Draven Sorath had made his own. The Lord rose from his seat in the second tier, and the movement alone was enough to stop every sound in the hall. He was dressed in full ceremonial armor, black and silver, with the crest of his house blazing on his chest. His plasma blade hung at his side, its hilt glowing faintly with contained energy. He descended the steps slowly, each footfall deliberate, and the crowd parted before him the way water parts before the bow of a ship. He reached the edge of the dueling circle carved into the center of the floor, and stopped. He looked at Danny the way a hawk looks at a mouse. Then he spoke. He invoked the trial of steel. His voice carried across the hall without effort. He declared that the human was not worthy of the Vailani bloodline. He declared that the honor of House Vailani demanded proof, real proof, written in blood and steel, that this creature from a primitive world had the right to stand where 10,000 years of warriors had stood before him. The hall erupted in murmurs. The priestess looked to High Lord Catharin, but there was nothing he could do. The challenge was legal. It was ancient law, and ancient law could not be refused without dishonoring the entire house. Catharin turned his gaze to Danny. Everyone turned their gaze to Danny. The message was clear. This was his chance to withdraw. No one would blame him. A human could not be expected to fight a Vailani lord in single combat. It would be understood. It would be forgiven. Katie grabbed Danny's arm from behind. She whispered urgently, her voice barely controlled. She told him that Draven was one of the most decorated warriors in the Dominion. She told him that Vailani plasma blades could cut through starship hull plating. She told him he did not have to do this. Sam stepped forward from the back wall and told Danny that if someone had to fight, he would do it. He was older, but he was willing. Chris said nothing. He just stood there, holding the oak case and watching Danny's face with the expression of a man who already knew what was going to happen. Danny gently removed Katie's hand from his arm. He looked at Sam and shook his head. Then he stepped forward alone onto the black stone of the dueling circle, and he accepted the challenge. The sound that followed was laughter. It began in the upper tiers and rolled downward like a wave, growing louder and more confident as it spread. The alien nobles laughed because the idea of a human fighting Draven Sorath was absurd. It was comedy. Several lords began placing wagers openly, not on whether Danny would lose, but on how quickly. The most generous estimate was 30 seconds. Draven smiled. It was a thin, cold expression that did not reach his eyes. The priestess called for the ceremonial weapons to be brought forward. A pair of traditional Velani honor blades were presented on a stone altar. They were beautiful and terrifying, curved swords with edges that shimmered with pale blue plasma energy. One was offered to Danny. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned away from it. He walked to Chris, who was standing at the edge of the circle, and took the oak case from his hands. The hall went quiet again, the laughter fading into curious silence. Danny set the case on the ground and unlatched it with steady fingers. He drew out a sword. It was not alien. It was not made of exotic alloys or powered by energy cells. It was a cavalry saber, forged from earth steel, with a leather-wrapped grip, and a blade that bore the marks of age and use and careful maintenance across generations. It was simple and old, and it had no right to be in this place. Danny held it the way a man holds something that is part of him. He raised it once, testing the balance, and the steel caught the light of the hall, and threw it back in a single clean line. The laughter was gone now, not because the sword was impressive. It was not. But something had changed in Danny the moment his hand closed around the grip. The quiet, polite man who had endured 2 days of mockery without expression was gone. In his place was something the Velani had never seen before. It was a stillness that had nothing to do with peace. It was the stillness of a man who had already decided how far he was willing to go. Sereth stood on the ceremonial platform above, her 4 eyes wide and her hands pressed against her chest. She had never seen Danny look like this. High Lord Ketharin leaned forward on his throne, and for the first time since the human had arrived on his world, something that might have been doubt crossed his ancient face. The priestess raised her hand and called for silence. The trial of steel was about to begin. The dueling circle was 30 feet across, carved into the black stone floor of the great hall, in a ring of ancient script that recorded the names of every warrior who had ever bled within its boundary. Some of those names were legends. Some were ghosts. Draven Sorath intended to add his name to the list one more time, and to make sure the human's name was remembered only as a footnote. He stepped into the ring first. His plasma blade was drawn and humming, a low vibration that you could feel in your teeth, even from the stands. The blade itself was a work of art, 3 feet of curved alien metal with an edge wrapped in contained plasma energy that burned at 4,000 degrees. It could cut through reinforced armor like paper. In the hands of a Velani warrior of Draven's caliber, it was less a weapon and more a death sentence. Draven moved through a series of formal stances as he entered the circle, each one a display of the Velani martial tradition. His body was fluid, precise, and powerful. Every motion said the same thing. I am better than you. I have always been better than you. Danny stepped into the ring with none of that. He walked in the way he walked everywhere, steady and unhurried, and he stopped in the center of his half of the circle and stood still. The cavalry saber hung at his side, angled slightly toward the ground, and his weight was settled evenly on both feet. His breathing was slow. His face showed nothing. The priestess stood at the edge of the circle and raised both of her weathered hands. She recited the rules in the old tongue. The duel would continue until one combatant yielded or could no longer fight. Killing was permitted, but not required. The use of any weapon beyond the blade in hand was forbidden. There would be no pause, no rest, no mercy, unless it was freely given. She lowered her hands. Draven attacked. He came in fast, faster than anything Danny had ever faced. The Velani were naturally quicker than humans, their reflexes sharpened by biology and by lifetimes of training that began in childhood. Draven's opening strike was a sweeping overhead blow delivered with enough force to split the stone floor beneath them. The plasma sword screamed through the air, trailing a line of blue-white light, and the heat of it washed over Danny's face like an open furnace. Danny moved. He did not block the strike. Blocking a plasma blade with earth steel would have been suicide. Instead, he stepped to the side, just barely enough, and let the blade pass through the space where his head had been a heartbeat before. The plasma edge hit the stone floor and carved a glowing trench into it, sending a spray of molten rock across the circle. Draven did not pause. He flowed from the first strike into a second, a lateral slash aimed at Danny's midsection, and then a third, a rising cut that would have opened him from hip to shoulder. Each attack was textbook Vaylani blade work, beautiful and devastating, designed to overwhelm an opponent with speed and power before they could think. Danny did not try to match the speed. He could not. No human alive could move as fast as a Vaylani warrior in full combat. But Danny was not trying to be faster. He was trying to be smarter. He read the attacks the way a man reads a sentence. Every strike had a beginning and an end, a wind-up and a follow-through, and in between those moments there were gaps. Tiny, flickering gaps that lasted fractions of a second. Danny lived in those gaps. He slipped between the strikes like water through a net, moving just enough to survive, never more than he needed to. He did not waste a single inch of movement. The crowd watched in confused silence. This was not how a duel was supposed to look. Draven was attacking with everything he had, and the human was still standing. It did not make sense. 30 seconds passed, then a minute, then 2. Draven pressed harder. His attacks became combinations, complex sequences of cuts and thrusts that flowed into each other without pause. He used the full range of Vaylani technique, high guards and low sweeps and spinning strikes that turned his body into a whirlwind of plasma light. The air in the circle was thick with heat and the smell of scorched stone. Danny weathered it. He deflected what he could not dodge, using angles instead of force. When the plasma blade came in too close to avoid, he caught it on the flat of his saber and let it slide along the steel, redirecting the energy rather than absorbing it. The old blade groaned and sparked where the plasma touched it, and the leather grip grew hot in his hands, but it held. Human steel, folded and reforged across generations, dense and stubborn, and too simple to know that it was supposed to break. Katie watched from the stands, with her hands pressed over her mouth. Beside her, Chris sat motionless, his eyes locked on the circle. Sam Greer stood against the wall, with his arms folded, and if you looked closely, you could see that his lips were moving. He was counting the seconds that Danny stayed alive, because every second was a victory. 4 minutes in, something shifted. The crowd began to feel it before they understood it. Draven's attacks were still fast, still powerful, but there was a new quality to them, a tightness in his shoulders, a fraction of a second longer between combinations. He was not tired, not exactly. Vaylani warriors could fight for hours, but he was frustrated. He had expected this to be over in moments, and instead he was fighting a man who refused to fall down. Danny saw it too. He had been watching for it. He had spent 6 months studying Vaylani combat recordings, learning the patterns, the rhythms, the tendencies. He knew that Vaylani warriors would train to win fast. Their entire philosophy was built around overwhelming force and decisive strikes. They did not train for long fights. They did not train for patience. Humans did. Danny had learned the sword from his father, who learned it from his father, who learned it from his father before him. It was a family tradition that stretched back to a time when humans fought each other with blades on horseback, and the lessons had never been about power or speed. They were about endurance, about reading your opponent, about waiting for the moment when anger replaced discipline. At the 6-minute mark, Draven overcommitted on a lunging thrust. It was a small mistake, the kind that only mattered against someone who was watching for it. His weight shifted too far forward, and his blade extended past the point of easy recovery. Danny stepped inside the arc of the plasma blade, closer to Draven than any sane fighter would dare, and he struck. The cavalry saber caught Draven across the outer forearm, just above the wrist, biting through the gap in his ceremonial armor, where the plates joined. Silver blood, bright and luminous, spilled onto the black stone. The hall went silent, completely, absolutely silent. 3,000 aliens stared at the silver blood on the floor, and not one of them made a sound. Draven staggered back and looked at his arm. He looked at his own blood as if he had never seen it before. In 600 years of combat, across wars and duels and training bouts beyond counting, he had never been cut. Danny stepped back and reset his stance. He did not press the attack. He did not taunt or gloat. He simply returned to the center of his half of the circle, and waited, the saber steady in his hand. A thin line of silver blood on the old steel. He was giving Draven the chance to yield. Draven did not yield. His 4 eyes blazed with fury, and he attacked again, harder and wilder than before. Technique gave way to rage. His strikes came in heavy and fast, less precise, but far more dangerous. The swings of a man who was no longer trying to win a duel, but trying to destroy something that had humiliated him. Danny took damage. A plasma slash caught him across the ribs on his left side, and he felt the searing heat bite through his coat and into his skin. A grazing blow burned across his shoulder, and the smell of his own scorched flesh filled his nostrils. He did not stop. He waited. At the 8-minute mark, Draven threw everything into a single massive overhead strike, a killing blow meant to end the fight through sheer force. He raised his plasma blade high above his head, and for one instant his entire body was open. Danny moved. He stepped forward, not back. He hooked the curved guard of his saber around the base of Draven's blade, just above the hilt, and twisted his entire body, hips and shoulders and core, all moving together in one unified motion. It was not a Vaylani technique. It was something older and simpler. It was a disarm that had been taught in cavalry schools on Earth 300 years ago, refined and passed down through a family that never forgot where it came from. The plasma blade was ripped from Draven's grip. It spun through the air and clattered across the stone floor, its hum dying to nothing. Danny placed the tip of his cavalry saber against Draven's chest, just over his heart. The steel was scorched and pitted from the plasma contact, but the point was still sharp, and it rested against the armor with the gentleness of a question. The hall was so quiet that Danny could hear his own heartbeat. He spoke. His voice was not loud, but in that silence it carried to every corner of the great hall, and to every broadcast drone, and to every screen across the Dominion. He said that he did not come here to prove that humans were stronger. They were not. He did not come to prove that humans were faster. They were not that either. He came because he loved a woman who saw something in him worth believing in, and he was willing to stand for that with nothing but what his family gave him: courage and steel. He lowered the blade. He stepped back, and he offered Draven his hand. Draven stood there, breathing hard, silver blood dripping from his arm onto the ancient stone, and he looked at the human's outstretched hand. He looked at it for a long time. The entire galaxy looked at it. Then Draven Sorath, lord of an ancient house, an undefeated warrior of the Vaylani Dominion, reached out and took it. For a long moment, after Draven took Danny's hand, nobody in the great hall moved. It was as if the entire building had taken a breath and forgotten to let it out. 3,000 pairs of alien eyes stared at the two figures standing in the dueling circle, one of them towering and silver-blooded and shaken to his core, and the other bruised and burned and still standing on 2 feet that had no business being steady. Then High Lord Ketharin did something that no one expected. He stood up from his throne. Ketharin had not left that seat during a public ceremony in over 40 years. He was old, even by Vaylani standards, and his body moved with the careful deliberation of someone for whom every step was a decision. But he rose, and the hall watched in stunned silence as the most powerful lord in the Dominion descended the steps from his platform and walked across the black stone floor to the dueling circle. He stopped in front of Danny. The two of them were a study in contrasts. Ketharin was nearly 8 feet tall, draped in silver and black, his 4 ancient eyes carrying the weight of centuries. Danny barely came up to his chest. His coat was burned and torn. There was red blood soaking through the fabric at his ribs, and his cavalry saber hung at his side, scorched but unbroken. Catherine looked at him for what felt like a very long time. Then he raised his hand and placed it on Danny's shoulder. In Vaylani culture, this gesture had a specific meaning. It was not affection. It was not warmth. It was recognition. It said in the silent language of a people who valued action over words, that the person standing before you had earned the right to be seen as an equal. The hall erupted, not in laughter this time, but in something that had no easy translation into human language. It was a sound the Vaylani made when something they believed to be impossible had just happened in front of their eyes. A low, resonant hum that started in the chest and rose through the throat, carried from one throat to the next, until the entire hall was vibrating with it. It was the sound of a world changing its mind. The wedding ceremony resumed. The ancient priestess spoke the sacred words with renewed gravity, and this time the hall listened with a quality of attention that had not been there before. Danny stood on the ceremonial platform beside Seraph, his burned hand in hers, and when the bonding rites were completed and they were declared joined under the light of the 3 moons, the silence that followed was not the silence of contempt. It was the silence of respect. Seraph looked at Danny with all 4 of her eyes, and there were tears on her silver cheeks, luminous and slow. She told him later that in that moment she had never been more proud of anything in her entire life. The reception that followed was unlike any Vaylani gathering in living memory. The political currents in the room had shifted so dramatically in the space of an hour that even the most experienced diplomats were struggling to find their footing. Nobles who had openly mocked Danny the night before now approached him with careful, measured words. They did not apologize. The Vaylani did not apologize. But they adjusted. The way a river adjusts when it meets a stone it cannot move. They flowed around him differently. Several warrior houses sent formal representatives to Danny's table to request information about what they were already calling human blade work. The concept had not existed in Vaylani martial tradition before that afternoon, and now half the combat masters in the Dominion were trying to understand what they had just witnessed. How did a species with slower reflexes, weaker muscles, and shorter reach manage to defeat one of their finest warriors? The answer was not something that could be easily explained. It was not a technique. It was a philosophy. Fight smart, fight patient, refuse to quit. Katie Burns spent most of the reception fielding questions from alien diplomats who suddenly wanted to know everything about human culture, human history, and human military traditions. She answered them with the careful precision of someone who understood that this single evening had done more for humanity's standing in the galaxy than 10 years of diplomatic negotiations. She caught Danny's eye across the hall at one point and raised her glass to him, and the look on her face was one of fierce, quiet pride. Chris Moran sat in a corner with a plate of alien food he could not identify and a drink that tasted like liquid copper, and he watched his best friend move through the crowd with the same calm steadiness he brought to everything. Chris had known Danny for 15 years. He had seen him fix engines in the rain, talk down hostile officers at gunpoint, and sit quietly through 2 days of insults without blinking. But he had never seen him like this. Danny was not performing. He was not pretending to be something he was not. He was simply being himself, and for the first time, the galaxy was paying attention. Sam Greer found Danny near the end of the evening, when the crowd had thinned and the lights of the hall had dimmed to a soft glow. Sam was not a man given to sentiment. He had spent 30 years in the Marines, and the closest he usually came to expressing emotion was a firm handshake and a nod. But he put his hand on Danny's good shoulder, the one that was not burned, and he told him that he had always known the kid had it in him. Then he walked away before either of them could say anything else. The most unexpected moment came when Draven Sorath approached Danny privately. near the balcony where the mountain wind carried the faint glow of the bioluminescent rivers below. Draven's arm was bandaged, the silver blood cleaned away, and he moved with the stiff care of a man whose pride hurt worse than his wound. He stood beside Danny in silence for a while, looking out at the darkness. Then he spoke quietly, without the theatrical projection he had used in the hall. He told Danny that in 600 years of life, he had fought in 37 wars and over 200 personal duels, and he had never been defeated. Not once. He said it not with bitterness, but with something that sounded almost like wonder, as if he was still trying to understand what had happened. He asked Danny where humans learn to fight like that. Not with power or speed, but with patience, with the willingness to take damage and keep going, to let the enemy tire himself out against something that simply would not break. Danny thought about it for a moment. Then he told Draven that humans learned to fight because they had no other choice. On their own world, they were never the strongest animals. They were never the fastest. They could not fly. They did not have claws or venom or armor. They survived because they adapted. They learned to read the things that were trying to kill them, to find the patterns, to wait for the right moment. And above all, they survived because they refused to stop getting back up. Draven was silent for a long time after that. Then he said something that Danny would remember for the rest of his life. He said that House Velani was fortunate to have him in its bloodline. Coming from Draven Sorath, there was no greater compliment in the galaxy. In the weeks that followed, the recording of the duel spread across the galactic concord like wildfire. Every species in the Alliance watched it. They watched a human with a primitive steel blade stand against one of the finest warriors in the Dominion and refuse to fall. They watched him take wounds that should have put him on the ground and keep fighting. They watched him win, and then they watched him offer his hand to the man he had just beaten. The elder species had spent centuries dismissing humanity as primitive, fragile, and irrelevant. The duel did not change that overnight, but it planted a seed of doubt in minds that had been certain for a very long time. Humans were something they had not accounted for, something resilient and unpredictable, and quietly, stubbornly dangerous. Katie Byrne was promoted to Senior Cultural Ambassador for the Velani Dominion, the highest diplomatic position a human had ever held in the region. Chris Moran was offered a lead position on a new joint engineering project between human and Velani scientists, designing hybrid technologies that combined the elegance of alien engineering with the rugged practicality humans were known for. Sam Greer turned down every offer that came his way and went back to the diplomatic station, where he continued to do exactly what he had always done. He said someone had to keep the lights on. On the last night, before they left the Spire of Falling Stars, Danny and Sereth stood together on the highest balcony, looking out over a world that had begun to change. The 3 moons were full, and their light turned the mountain peaks to silver and the valleys to deep blue shadow. The wind was cold, and Sereth leaned into Danny's warmth the way she always did, her silver skin against his rough coat. She told him that her people had a saying, that true strength is not found in the blade itself, but in the hand that knows when to raise it and when to lower it. Danny looked at the old cavalry saber resting against the balcony railing. It was battered and scorched and pitted from the plasma contact, but the steel was intact. It had survived, the same way it had survived every war and every generation that had carried it before him. He picked it up and felt the familiar weight of it, the grip worn smooth by the hands of his fathers. He told Sereth that humans had a saying too. It is not the size of the dog in the fight, it is the size of the fight in the dog. Sereth tilted her head and looked at him with all 4 of her eyes, and she told him she did not understand what dogs had to do with anything. Danny laughed. It was a real laugh, warm and tired and full of relief, the laugh of a man who had just walked through fire and come out the other side, holding the hand of the woman he loved. He told her he would explain it over a lifetime. Above them, the stars burned in their ancient patterns, vast and indifferent and beautiful. But somewhere among them, in the halls and councils and quiet conversations of 100 different species on 100 different worlds, something had shifted. A small crack had appeared in the wall of certainty that the elder civilizations had built around themselves. And through that crack, a little bit of human stubbornness had begun to seep in. It was not much, but it was a start. And humans had always been good at starts.